we will welcome those who are at home, and they will be able to ask questions too.
Let's see. Doing something? Hello. Good to see you. We have folks meandering ever closer from the parish hall. I came directly from removing my vestments and running around. And I'm away to his person. So who would have known 2.5 years ago that we would be able to have the kind of hybrid encounter that we're having right now, where we're welcoming folks in the parish hall and where we are welcoming Brian McLaren on Zoom and then streaming it to those who are joining us. You are all welcome indeed. I think that this is, do this so y'all can hear me a little better. I think that this is a thing to our program. Right? Our program year is based on hymn 424. And that refrain, anyone have that refrain down? Thanks be to God. Thank you, Jenny. Thanks be to God for the beauty of creation and our care for it, for the just, for the labor, for the care for the neighbor, for the beauties that astound us, for things that still give us, and most of all, that love has found us. Thanks be to God. And so it is from that posture of gratitude and also acknowledgement of those things that still confound us, that indeed there are mysteries of God that continue to confound us, on whose threads we will be pulling for the rest of our lives. It is to that foundation that we welcome Brian McLaren. I had a parishioner come out of the 745 this morning and say, I had Brian come to speak to my youth group decades ago. So you have folks who have known you along the journey in the parish. And he will speak with us about his latest publication, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned.
If I can add one thing, we've got our Spiritual Life Guild here, and this is sponsored by them. They suggested this book, and they made contact with Mr. McLaren. So thank you, Spiritual Life Guild. And now to somebody who needs no introduction, I will turn it over to Brian.
Thank you very much. Great to see you all. Those of you who are there in the parish hall, and those of you who are in your living room or kitchen watching from home, it's a pleasure for me to be with you. I just want to check and make sure that you all can hear me okay. I have lost the video to see you all there, but that's maybe okay. Does that sound all right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is answer 4 questions about the book. And let me just ask, I wonder if you all could put the volume level down, because I'm getting a little bit of echo back here, but that might help a little bit. If you can just maybe put my volume down there. But actually, that's better. Good, perfect. Just perfect. If you can still hear, great. That's good for me. I'd like to answer 4 questions about the book. First, why did I write this book, and why did I write it now? And on a very personal level, I'll just say that in my travels, I go around and speak a lot. I speak to clergy and other Christian groups. I speak to some multi-faith groups. But this question of staying Christian has just been rising and rising and rising in so many people's minds and hearts. I think it's been exacerbated by the rise of a certain kind of authoritarian and a resurgence of a white supremacist version of Christianity. This feeling that there's an awful lot of people that want to go back 50 or 100 or 200 years, and both in their opposition to science and their opposition to equal rights. This feeling that the Christian faith that has had this reputation for morality is actually doing some dangerous and harmful things in the world. And it's making a lot of people say, I'm just not even sure if I want to maintain my Christian identity. It's been, I've felt this question arising. Obviously, I feel it myself at times. I see well-known Christians or politicians who speak very publicly about their Christian identity, say and do things that I just feel are scary and harmful. And I know a lot of other people feel the same thing. This is happening right at a time when I think we need smart, wise, deep, loving, compassionate, insightful Christian leadership more than ever. As many of you would know, the Christian religion is the largest religion in the world. About 31 to 33% of the world's population identify as Christian. Now, we could argue about, how we want to define that term and whether they all live up to a standard we might set for it. But in terms of self-identification, about a third of the world's population, and that third of the world's population has the most money and the most access to weapons of any religious group in the world. We really need the Christian faith to do well, so that it could help everybody, especially at a time of climate change and a time of renewed threats of nuclear war, and a time where more and more wealth is being hoarded and controlled by a smaller and smaller number of elite individuals and families around the world. Suddenly we need the Christian faith to really rise and fulfill its potential. But a lot of us are worried that it is not doing that, but rather is, especially in the West, experiencing a time of aging and decline, numerical decline. And as you all know, COVID didn't help that either. A lot of people who stopped going to church because of COVID have not really decided whether they're coming back. And so you put all of those things in play. And this question of Christian identity is a live issue for a lot of people. And that was really at the heart of why I felt this is a book that needed to be written. What I wanted to do in the book is not try to argue people into staying Christian, because I don't think that works. I think if you tell people they're obligated to stay Christian whether they want to or not, it only increases their desire to detach from a Christian identity. What I wanted to do is to try to give the honest reasons why growing numbers of people are withdrawing from Christian faith. And that's what I did in part one. Part one simply called No. Do I Stay Christian? 10 chapters that explain why a lot of people are saying no. And I wanted to take those seriously. Now then in part two, it's simply called Yes. And I did not want to go through and say that those first 10 reasons are not good enough, because I think any one of those 10 reasons is reason enough for many people to leave Christian faith. But I wanted to ask the question with our eyes wide open to those first 10 chapters and those first 10 dissatisfactions that people are having with Christian faith, are there ways to say yes in good faith and in good conscience? And so that's what part 2, which is yes, really aims to do. Then in what I wanted to do in part 3 is to say, listen, some of us are going to stay Christian, some of us aren't, but tomorrow we've got to get up and decide what kind of human beings we want to be. And ultimately, I think that's probably the kind of question that would interest Jesus more than just the question of what label we hold. You'll recall Jesus said, look, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? In other words, I'm not really interested in the labels you use for me or even the labels you use for yourself. What I'm interested in, he said, is the kind of fruit that you bear, the kind of lives that you live. And this to me is maybe the deeper question underneath do I stay Christian is what kind of a human being do I want to be? And if I'm identified as a Christian, then let's focus on actually what that means in the way that I live. So that's kind of the big picture on what gave birth to the book. And I should say, in just a couple minutes, we'll be opening up for some questions, and I'll be glad to hear any follow-up questions that any of you would like to ask. The second question I wanted to respond to is as many of you know, I've been writing. I was a pastor for 24 years, and in the last 16 years, I've been a writer and speaker, and working mostly with clergy. And a lot of people ask me, what do I think the future of the church holds? And I'd like to try to just give a very brief answer to that. And then, again, you may have some follow-up questions. I think we should expect that the forms of Christianity that are getting uglier, angrier, more anti-intellectual, more racist, I think we should expect that they will get worse in the coming years. The reasons for the theological groundwork is laid for them to get worse. There are political actors that are doing everything they can to bring out the worst in Christianity because it helps their political aspirations. There are economic factors that money pours to certain forms of Christianity that reinforce certain ways of thinking that help certain people gain more power. I think we should expect that there are segments of the Christian faith that are going to get uglier and uglier and uglier in the coming years. If you expect that we're at the bottom or near the bottom, I think you're going to be very, very disappointed. But I think what that's going to do is it's going to force more and more Christians who maybe have been what we might call nominal Christians. They show up at church, they identify as Christian, but in some ways it's one of the minor features of their life. I think we're going to see an awful lot of people say, if that's what Christianity is becoming, something ugly and harsh and associated with things that seem anti-Jesus, anti-Christ, then I think more and more people, I hope like each of us, are going to wake up and say, if there's going to be a more beautiful and constructive and healthy expression of Christian faith, it's going to be up to people like us to start living that and to live it out loud. So when people think, what does the future hold? I think we have to get comfortable with the future holding opposite things. Some of the most beautiful expressions of Christian faith and some of the ugliest expressions of Christian faith simultaneously existing in Christian denominations. I mean, what this would mean for Episcopalians is to say that you shouldn't be surprised that there are Episcopalians who will use their Christian faith for harmful purposes as well as beautiful purposes. And the same goes in Roman Catholicism, and the same goes in Southern Baptists, and the same goes across the board. I think we can expect opposite things to be happening at the same time. Third question. Very often when we go through periods of deep change and almost like tectonic plates moving underneath our feet in the Christian faith, there have been challenges to authority structures. So, for example, those of us who identify as Protestant would look back 500 years and see that the all-male magisterium of the Catholic Church was challenged. It's challenged by Protestants like Martin Luther and John Calvin and later John Wesley and others, who said, you know what, authority doesn't reside solely in a hierarchy, in a human authority structure. We can take the Bible and use the Bible to challenge the authority structure. And so there was a deep conflict about where a greater degree of authority resided. Was it in the Bible, or was it in the tradition or the hierarchy or whatever? Well, 500 years later, I think Protestants have made themselves every bit as easy to ignore and easy to criticize as the Catholic Church did in the time of the Reformation. In other words, the kind of corruption that Martin Luther and others could point to in the Catholic Church is replicated 100 times over in Protestant churches around the world. And so I think we're in for another time of a deep shift in authority. And I don't think the authority of hierarchies is going to hold sway as it has in the past, especially as so many of those hierarchies, through scandal, through misbehavior, through cover-up, through criminality, have lost their moral authority. I don't think that pointing to the Bible and quoting the Bible is going to have the same power going forward, because we're watching people twist themselves into pretzels using the Bible to justify all kinds of unjustifiable things. And when you begin to realize how the Bible can be used to defend and prove things that are so obviously morally abhorrent now, just as has been the case over the last 500 years, but now it's becoming increasingly obvious, I think we're going to see that sense that just because you hold up a Bible and quote a Bible verse that you have authority, I think that's going to go out the window for growing numbers of people with each passing generation. So you say, well, where will authority reside? And I don't know. I think this is contested, but I think I'd like to suggest two areas to pay attention to. The first is moral authority, meaning how do we live our lives? What's very interesting to me right now is that in the Catholic Church, there is this struggle over the authority of Pope Francis. And there are many bishops who bitterly oppose Pope Francis. And it has been talk, and if you aren't aware of this, of schism in the Catholic Church. And in the American Catholic Church, many of the bishops oppose what Pope Francis is trying to do and what he stands for. What's interesting about Pope Francis is that he believes the only way forward in the Catholic Church is by admitting its mistakes. In other words, you may have heard that he recently traveled in Canada and talked openly about the horrible atrocities committed by the Catholic Church. By the way, Anglicans and Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists and Pentecostals have all of their similar skeletons in the closet. But what Pope Francis did is he acknowledged the wrongdoing and apologized. And you'll see this is a very different strategy than in the past, a strategy of cover-up, a strategy of minimization, to say, no, we've got to acknowledge the wrongs that have been done. There's a humility that carries moral authority. And also then there become acts of kindness that carry moral authority. I think that really, it goes right back to what Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. And I think that's what we're going to see increasingly going forward. But the second element of authority going forward that I'd encourage us to keep our eyes open for and evaluate what we think about this. It used to be that a group claimed to be the only ones who were uniquely right. And when they could be the only ones who were uniquely right, then that increased their sense of credibility and authority. But I think as going forward, we can use the example of a network, a computer network. The reason you all, when you want to search something online, there's a high probability that you go to Google to conduct your search, is because you know that Google is connected to the widest array of other of nodes in the internet around the world. So when you do a search, the search will find ideas and truths and resources and information the farthest reach possible. And I think part of what we're going to be looking for in religious communities going forward is not that they claim to be the only ones that are right, but that they can demonstrate that they're gaining wisdom from the widest array of credible resources out there. And an awful lot more we could say about that, but one of the things it means is that that people are going to be looking at the Episcopal Church, for example, and saying, do our Episcopal presiding bishops and leaders, do they have relationships with various Jewish communities and with Muslim communities and with Buddhist and Hindu communities? Are they in dialogue with atheists and agnostics and the spiritual but not religious? They don't want to have a sense that we're claiming we're the only ones with the truth and we don't have anything to learn from anybody. But they're saying we expect our leaders to be in deep dialogue with people of other traditions, and that increases our confidence in their leadership. So that's a thought about authority. And then finally, before we open it up for some questions, I think what a lot of people, especially in congregations like yours, are asking, congregations that take the tradition that they've inherited very, very seriously. What is the future for our tradition? Do you remember a few minutes ago, I said that I think we have to expect opposite things to be happening at once. The ability to hold duality and to hold multiplicity in our thinking without saying this is the only right answer, but the ability to say there is a both and going on here. This is what I think is tremendously important. I think there is a future for churches that hold and maintain centuries old traditions. I really do. I think there's beauty and depth that people appreciate. That only works, however, if along with preserving the tradition, we're also critiquing the tradition, where we're saying, are there elements of the tradition that are actually harmful? Are we perpetuating things that need to be left behind unintentionally? Are they sort of like parasites that are sneaking in our contemporary ways of thinking through some of our traditions? So this simultaneous ability to hold tradition and critique and improve upon tradition, I think is deeply, deeply important for us going forward. And what I think this will lead to is a desire for people to understand that the Christian faith is a whole tradition of traditions, and all of those traditions are in process. They're all developing, they're all evolving and growing. In other words, we want to maintain not a dead tradition that's frozen and stuck, but we want to maintain a living tradition that is always learning and always growing. And that, I think, is the only really viable option for us going forward. So those are a few thoughts maybe to get the ball rolling. And we'll open up for questions. If you want to ask a question, it can be repeated for me and I'll be able to hear it, or if questions are coming in online, we could respond to those too. And if you're nervous about asking the first question, we'll just skip the first question and go to the second question so you don't have to be nervous, okay? And you're muted for me, so I can't hear you. Sorry. Now I can.
I know you're going to get a wretched day on your end. Is this too unbearable? Should I put questions in the chat?
No, this is fine. Yeah, I can hear.
This is fine. So does anybody want to offer a second question?
Hello, I'm Brent. Thank you for being here. My question is that I really think often about the spectacle that comes from the two separating pieces of church interacting with one another. And I don't mean to sort of create some false equivalency because I think, we believe things and we believe certain things about how God tells us to live. But I often wonder how we are supposed to engage with the uglier parts of the church or other parts of the church because it's such a public thing. There's so many people watching, so many people who are spiritual but not religious or agnostic, especially of my generation. And I really would be curious as to your thoughts on that because it feels like such an odd conundrum.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Could you just say your first name for me again?
Sure, Brent. You're
Okay, thank you. Hey, listen, before I respond, I wonder, you obviously have thought about this quite a bit. I would love to just hear what to you feels harmful and counterproductive in the way that people often respond to differences? And do you have some sense of what you feel we need to see more of? Do you mind me? I'll respond, but I'd love to just hear your thoughts on it because I can tell you're a thoughtful person who's engaged, has thought about this some.
I wonder in some ways where my thoughts are, and part of I don't like conflict, to be honest with you, but I feel that I have a lot of friends. I would say most of my friends are probably, not, are in that spiritual, not religious group or in a different spirituality or just somewhere across the board. And I tend to feel that arguing isn't really helpful to anyone, like when Christians sort of argue at each other, and it is a little performative. And I think that people, a lot of times, the issues that they have with the church are somewhat relational and somewhat connected to ways they've been treated or, observed hypocrisy in their own religious experiences. But I also feel that sometimes, and when I talk to people, I sort of try to just be real with them and acknowledge, like, yeah, that's not okay. Like, that's a mess. Like, it's bad, But I also feel like maybe it could be avoiding the elephant in the room sometimes too. I don't know. I sort of don't interact with the I guess thinkers in Christianity that I think are unkind. And it's sort of interesting because I think that sort of gut reaction a lot of times sort of actually, it's like, oh, like this person doesn't seem like they're actually like thinking about how other people perceive them or how they're treating other people. And it tends to sometimes align with whether what they're saying is helpful or not. So I guess the question is it helpful? Like, I feel like I ignore it in some capacities.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Well, first, I really appreciate your insight on that. I think you're right. When we get into traditional arguments and debates, what tends to happen is two things. On a personal level, we end up with ego versus ego. And nobody wants to be humble enough to admit they might be wrong. And so what each person does is they bring their best arguments against the other without ever really doing serious listening. So on a personal level, we end up in a defensive, aggressive sort of posture. And that's seldom a posture of learning. And it's usually kind of ugly, as you say, and unkind. But the second thing that I think we frequently do is we end up performing our loyalty to our herd or our team or our group, our in-group. And so we perform our loyalty, and we're not really even communicating with the other person. What we're doing is performing for our in-group what a good, valiant soldier we are, and how we won't give an inch to those horrible other people. And that sort of thing, I think you're right. When we participate in that kind of dance, it feels disingenuous, it feels inauthentic, and all it does is hardens us all in our opposing positions. So the question is, what could we do differently? And as I've struggled with this over, really my whole career, because I've most of my adult life, I've been in the position of trying to challenge the status quo on many levels. Here's what I found can be useful. I'll just maybe offer two things. There's a lot more we could say. But the first is that I think we need the courage to differ graciously. When I say the courage to differ graciously, I mean it takes courage to not just let harmful things go unchallenged. So this means that we have to, in a sense, stand up, and we have to speak up, so that when someone says, for example, something that's racist or homophobic or just false, whether it's about climate change or human human dignity of some people of a different race or religion or sexual orientation or whatever. When those things are said, we can't just let them go unchallenged. But if we just have a vicious counterattack, we just perpetuate that kind of dance we were talking about. The courage to differ graciously involves me being able to say, wow, I see that differently. To say it not with hatred, not with an attack. Wow, you are so bigoted. Wow, you are so ignorant. That just creates attack and defense. But to say, wow, I see that differently. Now, when you say that, almost always a person will say, well, what do you mean? And sometimes it's appropriate to try to explain why you see it differently. But often you actually are giving a person a gift by just saying something like this. Well, I know you're probably acting out of your own religious faith. My religious faith, my Christian commitment leads me to see that all people have dignity. And my Christian commitment leads me to really take the science seriously on what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to the earth. And my Christian commitment leads me to take this seriously. And so I just wanted you to know, you're my neighbor, you're my brother, you're my friend, whatever. I love you, I respect you, but I see that very, very differently. That to me is often the best single step that we can take, because in so doing we differ, but we differ without hatred. We differ with kindness, but also with courage. I hope that helps. It's a challenge for all of us, and that skill of the courage to differ graciously is deeply important. And in fact, in the book, in part 3 of the book, it's one of the really deep skills that I think we need to take seriously. It's in chapter 26, where I talk about that in quite a bit more depth. So again, thanks for that really good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you would like to come and speak directly to the screen, you're welcome to do that. You don't have to. You can speak from there, but.
So following up on your comment about disagreeing graciously, sometimes I get really upset about harm done to others or whatever in the name of God sometimes. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any advice about how to stay in a kind headspace for those we disagree with.
And this is Don. Thank you, Don.
Thanks, Don. Did I hear right? How can you stay kind of in a kind headspace when you differ? Was that the question?
Yes,
Okay,
that is correct.
Great. So first, let me say that anybody who asks that question, I'm not worried about. In other words, if you're worried about staying in that kind headspace, that's a good sign. It's the people who just want to humiliate and crush and get revenge on their opponents that I'm worried about. But let me make two suggestions. The first is to self-report. Now, this is something we teach children. You know, they're getting mad at each other and the fists are coming up, and we try to tell them, use your words. And so what I'd like to recommend is that you find some words that express your emotion. So you say, for example, it breaks my heart when I hear people talk like that. You just make the statement. You're not calling them a name. You're talking about your own reaction. It breaks my heart when I hear people talk like that. It breaks my heart when I hear people speak about others in that way. Or you might say, I'm afraid when I hear people talk the way you're talking. I'm afraid that it's going to lead to violence. And I hate to think where we're going to go if we continue to accelerate our language that way. Again, you're not attacking the other person. You're expressing your emotion. And you're using words like heartbreak and fear and worry and concern. So that's one realm that I think we can explore, and we can find ways that work. And just a quick anecdote. I was invited to a dinner down here where I live in Southwest Florida a few months ago, and I was seated next to someone who started talking to me, and she was trying very much to establish common ground, and she made all kinds of assumptions about where I was coming from. When I told her that I had been a minister and that I was a writer and I wrote about theology and ethics and spirituality, she said, well, I just think it's terrible how they won't let us say Merry Christmas anymore. And I said to her, I got to be honest with you. I've never heard anybody get upset if I said Merry Christmas. Have you actually heard someone say that? And then she said, well, yes, I have. And then I asked her to explain. And then she said, and when she told me her story, I said, could I offer you a different way of interpreting what that person may have meant? And so it was very cordial. We expressed disagreement. And I just felt I was paying her respect to take her seriously, but I was also paying my self-respect to not let certain things go unchallenged. And when the meal was over and I was leaving, she actually chased me out of the building, out to the parking lot, and said, hey, I just wanted to tell you, I felt so good that we were able to have respectful disagreement. That's what the world really needs these days. So it was so moving to me that she wasn't offended by me differing, but that we were able to do it respectfully. So so that's the first thing I'd suggest. The second thing I'd suggest is here's two magic words to help us get out of that headspace of anger. They're the words, I'm curious. If you want to take away the contraction, it's three words. I am curious, but let's keep the contraction. I'm curious. So what I did with her is I said, I'm curious. Have you ever had somebody correct you for saying Merry Christmas? I'm curious. The reason I think I'm curious is almost magic words is because to be in the headspace of curiosity is very different than being in the headspace of attack and critique and rejection. And so often, if we can show genuine curiosity toward another person, I think it can change the tone and put us in a different zone, so to speak. So thanks. It's another great question, and one that I hope all of us will experiment with. It might take some time before we get more comfortable, but I think all of us need to get more comfortable because we need this courage to differ graciously.
I think we have time for one, maybe two quick questions.
This is probably going to require a longer explanation than we've had, but just a few tips on, my name is Diane.
On, I hate to even say it, getting our grandchildren back to church who are young adults and engaging with them in conversations about some of these issues, which I think really your book seems to address.
Well, first of all, thanks for that question. And I'll tell you, I would be super happy if the book could actually be helpful in those conversations with children and grandchildren. For example, you might just say, hey, I'm reading this book called Do I Stay Christian that is about the struggles that many people are having, especially younger people with religious identity. If you ever would be open, I would really be curious. And there's that word, we get into that space of curiosity again. I'd really be curious to find out what you're thinking about your own religious identity. And what I think becomes super important for those of us who are older is to ask those questions and make a solemn vow to ourselves that if someone gives them an answer, we're not going to attack their answer. It's just rude to attack you to ask a question and then attack the answer. But instead, if the answer becomes a new opportunity for curiosity, tell me more about that. Tell me, and just to have genuine curiosity, very often then invites curiosity back. And so that it might then go, well, Grandma, tell me how you've worked out your religious identity, or tell me how you've grappled with these issues in your own life. And then this can just lead to some deep and beautiful and meaningful and needed conversations. I also think I think there is a certain, I mentioned that chapter later in the book, chapter 26, that's called Renounce and Announce. I think there's a certain kind of announcement that more of our churches need to make, which is we have room for your questions, we have room for your doubts, we have room for your frustrations. We actually are interested in them, and we share a lot of them. If we can get that message out to people, and by the way, the series that you all are doing, that we're part of right now, I think helps create that atmosphere where some of those needed conversations can happen. So thanks for that. It's really important. And I would be so happy if a book like this could contribute to those needed conversations.
Thank you. One more quick question.
Hey, thanks for being with us. My name's David. I love the words courage to differ graciously. And I'm just wondering, as maybe this is the last question, maybe it's not, but is there anything you can equip us with to kind of take beyond this room, have a bigger impact? I mean, I think whether it's your words or civil discourse, we all see that we're losing ground on that every day.
Yes.
And it's troubling. And so how can we go into tomorrow, week ahead, months ahead, and kind of be the change we want to see in the world, a bigger impact?
Yes. Yes. Well, here's what I think it's going to take. It's going to take a willingness let me say it this way. There are people whose only concern is to dominate the space. They want to dominate the space. And one of the ways they do it is by sort of blanketing the space with an assumption of agreement. There's an awful lot we could say about this. It's part of the way authoritarian structures work, and part of what's going on in our world right now is a resurgence of a kind of authoritarianism. And this has been a subject of study of my own for some years, and in fact, I talk about that a good bit in this book. And so, in some ways, this courage to differ graciously involves a refusal to be intimidated into silence. And so it involves just every time you're able to graciously differ, in a sense, you're breaking the hold of silence and intimidation. Because if enough people are silent enough, then certain things are impossible to say anymore. And so the thing, I suppose, what I would want to equip you all with is this awareness that just being able to differ, you don't have to win an argument. You just have to differ courageously and graciously. The very act of doing that keeps some disequilibrium in the system, which keeps possibility for change. And then maybe the only other thing I can say is, I think it's important for people of faith to bring their faith to bear. Let's go back 150, 200 years in American history, when the standard belief among white people was white supremacy, and that slavery was legitimized, and that very few white people would have the courage to speak out against the economic system that was keeping white people rich, or that was keeping rich white people rich. What they needed to be able to do is have the courage to differ to their fellow white people, and to say, and that could just be, it often comes through best through the expression of discomfort, as in saying, I don't feel right about this. I don't feel good about this. My conscience bothers me about this. When I read the Gospels and I read Jesus to say, love your neighbor as yourself, this doesn't sit right with me. And what you're doing is you're sharing from your heart with vulnerability, and your testimony becomes a creative element in the system. I hope that helps. And the fact that these questions are of interest to you all is, to me, a great sign about your congregation. And I would just encourage you to keep encouraging each other in this vital work.
I'm going to ask people to hold your applause until our speaker has taken his earplugs out, because I think I just ask everyone to hold their applause until you take your earplugs out. But please know how grateful we are. This conversation will continue. Yes, please. Thank you so much, both for being here and for writing such a thought-provoking book. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. We finished just by saying thank you for being here and for giving us the gift of this wonderful book. So thank you. I will talk to Lacey to make sure that we are straight on all of our behind the scenes details.
Thank you so much. God bless. Keep up the good work. Thank you.